Hey everyone, this week's episode is a crossover between Bell Curve and Expansion. We discuss Unichain's launch, Succinct's big announcement, fault proofs, and more. Enjoy.
And then just have your ultra high scale like transactions being ZK verified and rolled up to that base layer as a way to build your chain. And I think in the future, like basically every transaction will be ZK proven. Like that's kind of how I see it playing out.
This episode is brought to you by Aries Markets. To learn more about Aries Markets, follow the link in the show notes below. Hey everyone, quick disclaimer before we get into today's episode. Nothing said on Bell Curve is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely our opinions, not financial advice. Our guests and I may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Expansion. You got me, Nick, Uma, Jill. What's going on, everyone?
Good.
Big week. Big week.
Big week.
Every week's a big week, Nick.
It's a little scary depending on what's going on in markets, Nick. But yeah. I have a question for the group too. Are you guys all going to ETH Denver this year, or what are the vibes that you guys have heard about?
I'm going to be there. Me and Emma at the Hacker House. Let's go.
Yeah, I'm going.
I will not be at the Hacker House. I'm not a hacker, but I will be in Denver.
You can still come and hang out. I'm not really a hacker either. I'm just a poser.
Okay, I'll pose with you, Nick.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
What have you guys heard vibes for ETH Denver this year? Like, are people excited? Does it feel like it's going to be as big as last year, subsequent years, or maybe
it's going to be trauma bonding for the whole Ethereum ecosystem.
Yeah.
Seems a lot smaller. Like, I just feel like less people are going overall. Honestly, it's kind of nice. Like, the bear market vibe conferences are better for me.
It almost feels a little bear market vibesy at the moment, more so than it's definitely a weird in between of. It's definitely not like full on bull. That's for sure. All right, so we got a bunch of topics, but before we get into it, I just did want to give a quick shout out to DAS. So DAS is Blockworks' institutional conference. It's going to be the biggest one we've ever done this year. 2,500 people in the New York Golden Bull Market. So we've got Mohammed Al-Arian, who's one of the keynotes, Mike Novogratz, Kathy Wood. It's going to be phenomenal. So if you're a fund manager, I know this is more of a technical crypto native focused podcast, but if you're a fund manager or you want to meet institutions, banks, etc., this is a conference for you. All right, let's get into it. And code expansion 10. So you get 10% off. Use code expansion 10, and thank me later. So expansion 10. We'll see you at DAS in New York in March 18th to the 20th. This episode is brought to you by Aries Markets. Aries Markets deployed on Aptos in 2022 and is now the largest lending protocol with $280 million in TVL. To learn more about Aries Markets, follow the link in the show notes below. This episode is brought to you by Marinade. Marinade is a high-performance staking delegation platform that brings both liquidity and security to the Solana network by connecting SOL holders with the best staking rates on Solana. Follow the link in today's show notes to learn more. All right, I want to get into the announcements of the week here, and maybe we could start with unpacking Unichain. So this has been something that's been announced for a little while, but it went live this week. And just as a reminder for Unichain, they also went live. They collaborated with Flashbots to basically create these very fast, they call it flash blocks. So it's built on a TEE. There are these successions of 4 roughly 250 millisecond flash blocks, which get verified by this new layer, which is the UVN, Uniswap Validator Network. So Jill, I'm very curious to get your take here because mechanically it looks similar-ish, right, to what Espresso is.
Yeah, there are elements of the UVN that are very similar to what we've built. But we can get into it. I want to let you tee it up first.
Okay, cool. And then, the other thing, I mean, they announced that they're launching with 80 apps and infra builders that are already either building on the app or supporting the app. It's launching as a stage 1 rollup already, which is cool. And they've got cross-chain interop from day one. We mentioned the UVN, which looks a little bit like their own like home-built restaking, like restaked part of their application as well. And 65% of network fees are going to UVN stakers. So I saw Hart posting about whether or not this looks a little bit like a covert fee switch that got turned on, but that's certainly very interesting. I think the amount that you stake as a part of a UVN, there's a pretty high barrier to entry there. And the amount of fees that you get is relative to the amount of stake that you're contributing. So I don't think it's just available for anyone to do, but still, it's pretty cool. And
have they shared the details on that yet of the economics? I know they shared the 65%, but of what the threshold is for staking, because the UVN is not actually live yet, is my understanding. It's
no, I don't think it is
being
either.
built. It's still in design phase.
Yeah. And from my understanding as well, like I think they're still trying to figure out what exactly the UVN really does and what they're secure. But it's basically it's like it's an additional security layer to verify.
I have theories. I have theories about what
What are your
Can you
theories?
do we need a tinfoil hat for these theories, or what do you think, Nick?
My theory is twofold. One is the reality is that like I think it's a backup for like proof-based bridging. It can be faster. So like you could just have a committee-based bridge. It's like the UVN validator signed off, and therefore we can bridge to Solana faster or wherever they're getting like sourcing liquidity from or to. So that's one. And then the other is Unichain is built on blobs, and ETH blobs are just like there's just not enough throughput, I think. And so maybe it will scale in time, maybe not, but there's a high likelihood it won't. And so the UVN, it could be like their sort of like alt DA source, which basically they just become their own like side chain. It's kind of like an escape hatch if Ethereum doesn't scale. That's my interpretation.
Their own native DA, their own sort of layer 0 style messaging committee. Talk about vertical integration for an app. That's interesting.
Yeah. That's all. I mean, that's also all of the major elements of an L1 as well, just to point that out.
I mean, they would basically be their own side chain at that point. But I mean, I think it would be like a temporary thing. I think their intention is always to be an Ethereum roll up. But like if Ethereum doesn't scale in time, they don't want to like suck and lose their business to like their competitors. You know what I mean? So I think it's a very savvy decision.
Joel, I'm curious what you guys think of. I have other questions and thoughts as well, but I'm curious.
One thing I want to say about UVN too is, I mean, it's interesting that they're not using restaked ETH, right? Like, why aren't they using Eigenlayer? Like, they do have their own token. They're using that. I feel like these big apps are not going to really want to do restaking if they do have these validator networks. That's my own pet theory.
Yeah, I was curious about that too. Actually, I remember in DevCon this year there was some like MEV hacker house hosted by Sorella, and I ran into a bunch of the Uniswap people. And this was like still much earlier in development here, but we're talking a little bit about the UVN. I was like, this is kind of interesting. Like this feels like even not Eigenlayer necessarily, but Symbiotic has a pretty different approach to restaking, where it seems like their differentiation is that they really sit down with especially like bigger brands and help them. Because a lot of these like big protocols, they might not want it. First of all, they don't want to necessarily be an AVS from a branding standpoint, but also they want to use their own native token as like security. So it felt like they could have worked with Symbiotic or something and maybe chose not to, or maybe, I don't know what it is. But yeah, it's interesting that they in-house the entire thing. I agree with you, Nick.
I mean, I think that there's a reality here that we can all skate around for the next 5 minutes or just acknowledge, which is that like a motivation for launching these types of things is to have utility for the token, either that already exists or that's forthcoming. And I think that that's fine, actually. Like, I don't know, it's Trump's America. We can say that out loud now, right? Like, I think that it's totally fine to want to have utility for your token, especially if you were in Uniswap's position where you got kind of backed into a corner several years ago with like whatever the vampire attack of SushiSwap and the Sushi airdrop and Sushi trying to steal all of the DEX volume and users with their own token. Uni had to respond to that, and yeah, I mean, it makes total sense for them to want to have utility for that for their community of holders. I mean, I just think it's interesting because I feel like for the last 2 years, all I've heard about from people is like, we need to decentralize roll-ups. And like often, unless you're really deep in this, people are not actually super specific about what that means. I mean, I know this better than most. Like people, will scream about decentralizing the sequencer without actually getting super specific about what they want out of that or what risk they're trying to mitigate. And so, I mean, I think that it's really cool to see a major chain, even though they only just now exist. I'm still going to call them a major chain just because they're such a big brand, going in this direction from the beginning, at least with the design for decentralized components of the network or of the chain itself. Yeah, and my understanding of it is that the UVN is really solving a couple of problems. I'll add a third one, actually. Maybe it's data availability as well, as Nick just pointed out. I hadn't even thought in that direction. But
Yeah,
one of the other problems that they're solving is, how can they get fast, kind of robust confirmations and prevent sequencer equivocation? So Unichain is still using a centralized sequencer. Like the UVN is not a decentralized sequencer, but and this is where it's like espresso, and there's a few others in this category of kind of like confirmation layers. The layer itself, the network itself, is providing a confirmation on top of whatever pre-confirmation the sequencer puts out there. And I think that that's important, especially when it comes to cross-chain, right? Because if you are living in this very cross-chain world, then you suddenly have many different chains having to depend on whatever the sequencer has put out there. This is already the case, right? Solvers depend on sequencer pre-confirmations. That's how they can be so fast and cheap. And so you want a way to prevent basically the sequencer from rug pulling. And if you have economic security behind it, if you have BFT consensus behind it, then that just radically changes your trust assumption relative to trusting a centralized sequencer on it. There's also this other category of things that the UVN is doing, which I won't pretend to fully deeply understand, but my sense is that unlike something like espresso, they are also doing validation of or verification of the transactions, which I think is like a little bit more akin to, Nick, what you were saying in terms of being the equivalent of perhaps like a layer 0 committee. My sense is that eventually ZK solves this, but maybe that's just like my sense of everything is that ZK eventually solves it. But Uma, I'm curious if you have a take here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm obviously biased, but I think Unichain could adopt something like OP Succinct even like tomorrow if they wanted, and not really require a lot of the UVN stuff to rely on like bridging. I think one of the problems with like basically having these really weird different trust assumptions. So, for example, like, maybe some chains have like layer 0 tokens, and then Unichain is going to have their UVN secured tokens, is that the heterogeneous security model makes it really hard for people to reason about what's actually going on. And so when I see something like UVN, I think it's quite interesting as a way to give utility to the Uni token, which I think is great. But I feel like it further complicates and fragments like the interop story in a way that I don't necessarily see as like super positive. And I think if they use something like OP Succinct, ZK, even in the short term, they could just have like really fast finality, like 1 hour instead of 7 days, in a very native canonical way.
Yeah, well, doesn't that say, I mean, you got to imagine Unichain looked at Hyperliquid and thought, that's pretty interesting. And I don't know, they definitely learned some lessons there. And it seems like they've actually probably been thinking about this in a relatively similar way for a long time. And, I think that it's probably appropriate for L1s at this point, because we've all just thought of L1s as these big general purpose chains that we're going to do everything on. But like 10 years into this experiment, it's really DEXs and stablecoins for the most part, right? Like we hope that there's going to be decentralized social media, gaming, whatever. And this is a big win for OP. And it didn't actually really occur to me until just the second that, when you look at the BD of like the big chains, right? Like ZK Syncs, the Arbitrums, the Optimisms has been pretty focused, right? Like who are their big wins? It's Coinbase, Kraken, Uniswap. Like that to me feels pretty intelligent, right? Just in terms of the amount of transactions that you're going to be generating with that crew. But I sort of feel like Unichain, probably paid a lot of attention to Hyperliquid. And they've got all of the elements that they need to launch their own fully standalone chain. Like you have to imagine it's crossed their minds, right, to prepare for that inevitable. I'm not saying that they're definitely going to do that, but I would guess, if ETH ever, like the amount of ETH bridged up to Unichain started to drastically go down, or everyone just wanted to trade with USDC pairs, like I feel like at that point, why do you really need, like, you just launch your own L1, right? Like that's what
I want to chime in there because like I do think in the long term, not every app is its own L1 because there are benefits to having shared security that you can only get by sharing a common consensus and DA layer. So like I often hear this thing of like, oh, well, if you are maximally bullish on these like really highly specialized application specific chains, then they'll all just be their own L1s because they'll be big enough that they don't need to like borrow security or inherit security for something else. And I disagree because if we want to have this like internet, this like secure internet of decentralized applications, they're going to want to co-locate on one common security zone. And I think that's something that will play out in the future. Maybe it's like not clear that will right now, but I think it does matter. So even if like you don't, and that's why alignment, you're right. Alignment with ETH, who gives a fuck about that? Like 10 years from now, no one's going to give a fuck about that. No one's going to give a fuck about alignment with the underlying L1. It's a business relationship. It's a service provider relationship, not like I have a social layer or whatever. That totally should go away. But in terms of the network effect around co-locating with other applications, that absolutely will exist.
The problem with that, though, is that today no one is actually using L1 security for their bridging transactions between two different rollups.
Uma's going to fix
that. Say again?
Uma's going to fix that.
I mean, a lot of people are in the trenches trying to fix that, but like that's not the reality today. And so I think that there's like, okay, the longer term vision of whether it's the ETH-L1, I think that the ETH-L1 is always going to be too slow to provide that level of, actual security guarantee for cross-chain transactions. Even if, yes, all of these rollups are still deriving security from it, like no one's waiting for L1 finality. You're always going to be needing either to just trust the solver and trust the sequencers or some other kind of fast finality layer. I think that it's kind of a hard argument for me to see.
Well, I think I really agree with Nick that being at L1, if you look at it as a business decision, actually being a roll-up can be a lot better, even economically. So, for example, if you look at the amount that is paid out to stakers for economic security, a lot of the top L1s pay like hundreds of millions of dollars a year for their economic security. And okay, there's arguments, and Celestia is doing this thing where they reduced their inflation schedule, and I know Solana is also doing the same thing, but it's actually just quite a lot of money. And ZK is just going to get cheaper and cheaper. Like economic security does not inherently get cheaper, whereas ZK technology does get cheaper. There's like a Moore's law effect. So from a purely financial perspective, like it's actually cheaper to be a roll up. And that's also better for your token because stakers get paid your token and then they sell your token. So I think we're actually maybe already or very close to being a world where being a full ZK rollup and getting verifiability through cryptography instead of emissions is just better financial decision. And then I think there's also a lot of other user experience benefits to being a rollup. I know MegaETH has really popularized this notion of like single sequencer good. And yeah, of course, like the sequencer is not decentralized, which maybe has some issues. But also because there's just one, you can have really, really fast finality, really, really fast pre-confirmations. It looks much more like a Web2 API than some like weird blockchain thing where you have to wait for the block and you have to wait for a bunch of other transactions, which is very counterintuitive. Like if you're building in Web2, you're not like, oh, I wait for my API request to be bundled with 10 other ones before it gets fulfilled. That's weird. So I think even from a UX and like developer experience perspective, the rollup framework where it's like you have one guy processing all the transactions and then verifying them with ZK and posting them to some other layer is a lot better.
Rollups are the new servers. Okay, so I agree with the end state, but let me push back on some of that. So one, I think you actually can make an argument. I mean, yes, you're paying a lot of money out to stakers, but you've really printed that money out of thin air, right? Like it's not, there really is a big difference in between dollar cost versus like token equity that you can just spin up. But the other thing too is that early stage startups don't really think in terms of, you think of in terms of cost, but really you should be prioritizing growth, I think. And I think the important perspective here, because sometimes people talk about this from like a normative, desirable end state for the industry. Whereas I feel like the perspective that you need to think about is who are the big companies that have leverage and what kind of swings are they going to want to take? And I can see like the vision and why this is so compelling is because if you can be like the L1 DEX, the purpose built DeFi L1 DEX that maybe you're built around a DEX to begin with, like a Hyperliquid or an Atlas or a Unichain, then not only are you an exchange, but you also have this kind of weird call option on, okay, if I can become so large and I can have so much liquidity on my platform and I have that much leverage, I probably can convince other apps to build around me. And then I get this other revenue stream, which is just transaction fees or sequencing fees or whatever it is from all of these other apps. And maybe that's why I think the Tether announcement, the Tether Plasma chain that just came out. Like I know Framework and Bitfinex led. It seems like this is what the chain that Tether wants to anoint and say, okay, this is officially Tether. Yeah, I'm sure some element of Tether was just like, hey, we have an enormous amount of leverage. We have $150 billion of market cap. We're the runaway stablecoin. Why am I paying fees to something that's wildly commoditized at the bottom? So I think a lot of people are going to take swings at this, but only a very small amount are going to be successful. And then you are going to end up, but this is like the whole history of computing, right? It's like centralized mainframes and servers and on premise, and then it kind of decentralizes out again.
But in that analogy, exactly, what cloud is what the modular stack is, where you have instead of a data center like AWS or Azure or whatever, you have a data availability layer, a data availability network that is like your remote virtual server that is like scale out and super cheap, and they're not like charging extractive costs, and it's just like, yeah, rock up, deploy your thing, and like, save yourself the hassle of setting up your own on-prem server thing. And it just, to me, it makes a lot of sense. I actually don't think, I think people just still haven't woken up to that reality, and they have this idea of the L1 premium or what have you. But like, I just don't really see a strong argument for like, what's the difference between Tether having their own L1 versus their own rollup, in terms of they can still be a platform. They can still absolutely be a platform. They still have their own chain, et cetera. But like, it's almost like now you're conflating your business. You're trying to be an infrastructure provider at the same time as you're trying to be this platform. I just don't think that's going to be like a long-term strategy that people care about. And again, the network effect around wanting to share security and co-locate with apps, I think will end up being strong. It's not strong or apparent now, but it will. So I don't know. I just disagree.
I think you're right that really big companies, for example, Tether, it kind of makes sense for them to build an L1 because they have the resources, they have the brand, and they probably want like full control of the stack. So, for example, Google builds its own data centers, but that's Google. Every single other company uses, AWS or these clouds. And I think even in terms of go-to-market timelines, building a rollup is much, much, much faster than building an L1. And there's even like other factors that I think a lot of people don't consider. So, for example, even if you build an L1 with the Cosmos SDK, my understanding is it's actually a lot harder to get it like listed on exchanges because they have like a lot higher integration costs and blah, blah, blah. And rollups, Ethereum is this like standardized framework, and that has a lot of benefits in terms of making it interoperable and like getting all these other parties to integrate. And if everyone's building their own L1, that kind of like that benefit of blockchain is like kind of lost.
I agree. I actually don't think that we're in disagree. I'm just disagreeing on the path that it takes to get there. Like even Nick, I think there's a strong urge, and in order to get to cloud computing, you had to do on premise, right? Like at first it was actually mainframes, and then there was like the actually website era where every website was its own server, and then you had on premise, and then you went to cloud. And so I think, and actually there's an analogy here with like foundries, like all the IBMs and the chip makers of the world used to run their own foundries too, until TSMC basically did the pure play foundry business model. So there's like there are all these advantages, right? Like you can see why someone sitting in Tether's seat would be like, I should want to have my own L1, but then eventually the reality does hit. Most of those end up being unsuccessful. And then you do have these like services, like a cloud sort of backend. But to do that, you have to scale really aggressively, which is why I like the vision of, so this was the original thing that got me interested in Solana. It was like the massive blocks, intense scalability at the L1 single slot finality. But I don't know if Ethereum is planning on going that way or if they have a different view of the world. But I think that's if I could wave a magic wand, I would love to see that same focus I think that's the way to go for Ethereum also. But
I mean, just to bring it back to OP and their strategy, which I think is kind of where you started this, like they've got all of these big brand names. I think I could make the case that any of those big ones we mentioned, Unichain, Kraken, Coinbase with Base, obviously, even some of the others they have like World Chain, like they all could have been in this category, like Uma just said, where they're like, all right, I should, like Google with cloud, like I should own the full stack. And it's a criticism I hear sometimes of OP. Like I feel like generally the vibe is that OP is winning out of the stacks because they do have all of these big hubs of distribution on board, but it is the risk that they take that at some point these chains, these projects are going to say, we want to go build our own chain. I don't actually think that's as big of a risk as I sometimes hear people make it out to be, because you look at like Apple, right? Like Apple, I think one of the smartest companies in the world, they never said we need to run our own cloud infrastructure. Like they pay other players for that, right? They specialize in what they do really well and they have their own business model. And I think that may play out as well with some of these larger chains. So I think it's more about that. I think that we do end up having a lot more chains as rollups, whether it's on Ethereum or anywhere else. But I think that it more comes down to those business model considerations as opposed to some like cross-chain shared security dynamic that comes back to Ethereum.
Yeah. And I don't know, maybe it's something that just has to play out is you have to have a bunch of hyperliquids. Like I could imagine, right? Like hyperliquid launches, they said, oh, we're not just a perp dex, we're a new L1. And then they don't attract that ecosystem of apps. And everyone was like, oh yeah, it's actually just a perp dex. And Ondo is actually just a lending protocol and whatever. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, these are all just apps and they don't deserve this L1 premium, like this L1 premium that they get now. And then that would be a huge disincentive to, do this. I think eventually specialization wins out for sure. So I'm completely on that page too. Quick shout out to today's sponsor, Aries Markets. Aries Markets deployed on Aptos in 2022 and is now among the top 10 lending protocols across all blockchains with $280 million of TVL. Aries Markets has expanded its product suite to become a fully integrated DeFi hub combining lending, borrowing, and more. In 2024 alone, Aries introduced several new features to better meet the needs of its users, including native USDT support, an incentive program, and more. Click the link at the bottom of the show notes, head over to Aries Markets, and tell them that I sent you. Hey everyone, quick shout out to today's sponsor, Marinade. Since launching in 2021, Marinade has expanded their suite of products to provide solutions for both DeFi users and TradFi, including liquid and native staking, as well as direct enterprise integrations. Marinade's platform is optimized for institutions to securely expand their exposure to Solana. Whether through the provisioning of custodial or non-custodial yield, integrating staking rewards into Solana financial products, or leveraging Marinade's best-in-market rewards rate for revenue and treasury management. Whether you're in DeFi, TradFi, or somewhere in between, Marinade has something for you. To learn more about Marinade, follow the link in today's show notes. Uma, I want to turn the focus to you here because you had a big week. You had the Prover testnet go live, so congratulations, round of applause here. But can you give us a little bit of a sense of, like, just starting at a high level, what you guys just launched or went live with this week?
Yeah. So for some background, we've been building a ZK VM called SP1, which basically makes ZK really easy and simple to use. And the reason I'm really passionate about rollups is because, we think that every rollup is going to be ZK with these ZK VMs. But even with the ZK VM, there's still a lot of, it's hard to actually generate proofs because it's like a really intensive workload. And so our prover network is kind of like, you can think of it as a cloud offering for our ZK VM. So in the prover network, instead of like you generating proofs on your laptop, you can send it to our network. And it's a decentralized protocol to coordinate a bunch of provers all across the world to generate proofs for SP1. And in that sense, I guess it looks pretty similar to like mining, where you have like a bunch of, miners all across the world that are mining these like hashes to secure Bitcoin. And with our protocol, we want to have a bunch of provers all across the world generating proofs to help secure like all chains in the future. What we launched with the testnet this week is kind of like stage 1 of building out the whole network. So what we launched is like a way for anyone to interact and like generate proofs and send it to the network. So that's phase 1. Phase 2, which will be in like 1 to 2 months, will be kind of going to the other side of the market and letting anyone connect as a prover. And then phase 3 will be like the full protocols live, mainnet, etc. So yeah, that's like what functionally the testnet is. It's like just letting anyone send requests to the network and generate proofs with it. There's also like, beyond just the protocol, I think the thing a lot of people really liked about the testnet, and my Twitter DMs are all like begging, it's completely destroyed because everyone's just begging for invite codes, is we had a bunch of like fun applications of ZK that users could kind of interact with on our testnet website. And they're actually pretty addictive and like pretty fun. So you should, I don't know if anyone here played, but
I played.
yeah. So we had a few different applications like, you can prove an Ethereum block. You can play ZK Flappy Bird, where you play Flappy Bird and then generate a proof of your high score. And we had a few other fun apps. And so we kind of made it this like video game theme. And yeah, people seem to really, really, really enjoy it.
It's so good. Also, just like the aesthetic of it, it took me immediately back to being 14 years old in like 2004, sitting at my parents' desktop computer. Just the detail-oriented nature of how you guys went about the actual product experience and the vibe of it was so strong. I think it's the strongest product release I've seen in crypto in a really long time. I'm curious if you can share any of the backstory. You said that your co-founder was super involved in the actual product development and design, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we started with being like, we want to do our prover network testnet, and we've been building with ZK for like years. And, we're in like cryptography, math, Rust, engineering world. And we feel like no one has kind of done ZK justice, if that makes sense. Like ZK's always just been this like very abstract, it's moon math, it's complicated. And we wanted to kind of show the world ZK in a way that was like fun and understandable. So that was like our biggest inspiration. And we're like, okay, what's like a way to make ZK fun? And that's kind of how we came up with the concept of making like these games that are ZK provable. And also another reason why it's like for the first time kind of possible to like, for example, ZK proof Flappy Bird is because of SP1 and like the tech we built. Because before, if you wanted to ZK prove anything, it would be impossible because you'd have to slave away on like custom circuits for months. So it's really difficult. But now you can just like write normal code and ZK prove anything. So a few engineers on our team who mostly do front end were able to like ZK prove all these random things in like, a month worth of time by writing normal code. Like they don't know cryptography at all. So yeah, that was like the backstory.
Uma, what's happening on the back end? Because like one thing I really appreciated about it was it does abstract all of that away from me as the user. I'm just like, okay, cool. Like now there's like a magical proof of my very low high score. But like, can you walk us through what's actually happening there and like who consists today of the network of provers generating this?
Right now, the network is it's a network of size 1, so it's just us. Like we're generating all the proofs on the back end.
Testnet to be expected.
Yeah, it's a testnet. And then in phase 2 of the testnet, we want like everyone to connect and become provers. What actually happens on the back end is basically when you like connect your wallet. So for the testnet, you get to deposit like real USDC. So it's like 10 USDC deposit. And that actually pays for the proofs. So basically you sign a transaction that's like a proof request transaction. That's like, here's, my public inputs, here's like the program I want to prove, and then the network generates a proof and like sends it back to you.
Cool. I dig it.
All right, Uma, I've got a question for you about, so you had also this accompanying document, like a crisis of trust, and you outlined some use cases for ZK in the future that I wanted to poke at a little bit. But before we get there, could you actually just, for listeners that might not have a great mental model for what a prover network is, can we start with the mental model of what like a staking pool operator sort of is, like, right? Like just staking and L1s in general. And in your announcement, you had this sort of transition of blockchains, different consensus mechanisms from proof of work to proof of stake to ZK proofs. So can you just walk through for listeners what that transition is going to be like? And I'm just very curious to understand, like, what do the economics look like of being a prover versus a staker? What sort of hardware do you have to run? Do you imagine that getting done locally? Or like, what is the trade-off of individuals proving versus large centralized proof generation? Like, what does that all look like?
Yeah, so with proof of work, which was like the original way that blockchains were secured, you had a bunch of people all across the world who are basically securing like the tip of the chain by doing a bunch of work that's verifiable. And then you'd come to consensus by like the branch of the chain that had the most work attached to it. And then in proof of stake, we kind of replaced that work because it's wasteful. Like you're just having people mine these like SHA hashes with economic security and money. So it was like you had capital, you would stake your capital, and then if you kind of try to fork the chain, you get slashed. And that's how we got verifiability. And then I think the final evolution of this, and this actually ties back to what I was talking about earlier, where ZK is actually cheaper than proof of stake, is that instead of having verifiability through economic security and relying on this like staked capital, you can just have ZK proofs of what happened with the latest transactions, and then that can be settled to some base layer that's doing consensus. So for example, like you still need a base layer that's doing consensus on like the ordering of stuff, but then you can actually like scale that infinitely with ZK. So I think right now, like it is actually very similar to what I was saying earlier. Right now, people like build L1s and have, proof of stake security because that's kind of like what's been done. But with ZK, it's actually cheaper and more efficient to leverage an existing base layer and then just have your ultra high scale like transactions being ZK verified and rolled up to that base layer as a way to build your chain. And I think in the future, like basically every transaction will be ZK proven. Like that's kind of how I see it playing out.
Yeah, I love that framing. I mean, the way that I see it is like, in theory, the way things were supposed to go from like Satoshi's original vision and the way that blockchain started, including Ethereum, was like everyone was supposed to run their own node and actually re-execute every transaction and verify everything themselves. And then that just turned out to not be practical because it's hard to set up a node, it's expensive, it's just a pain in the ass, like a terrible user experience. Like if that was actually the way that everyone had to use a chain, like we wouldn't have any users right now. And so then people kind of like got lost in this, I think, mistaken security model of blockchains, which is like, oh, it's all about economic security. The validators actually run the chain and we just trust them to not cheat on us. Was never supposed to be the way it was supposed to be. Like that just boils down to like a committee based assumption, which is like not really a big step forward from like Web 2 itself. Right. So, we were always supposed to be running nodes and validating things. The thing is that doesn't scale for shit because you have to download the whole block. That's where data availability comes in. And then you have to re-execute everything yourself. And that's where ZK comes into play, or any kind of like execution proofs. It's like, instead of having literally every billion person in the world that's using this chain have to know about and verify everyone else's transaction, we just have one guy who's running a prover do it, and you can just verify it, with very, very little work. So like ZK is really like the end game for bringing us back to this, and the combination of that and data availability sampling brings us into a world where you can run this light node and actually verify everything that's happening on chain directly yourself, interact with the chain directly. Hyper bullish. Thanks to Succinct for making ZK sexy.
Yeah, you know what's funny about that too is we'll talk about Arbitrum's Bold that they just launched this week, but the origin of fraud proofs actually, I think it was proposed back in like 2014 or 2015, and it was to get around the honest majority assumption. So the idea was basically that you could have one full node generate a fault proof, and then light nodes could verify it. So yeah, it's just interesting that like this idea is maybe coming back, and we're actually giving blockchains a big upgrade. What is the incentive for? It would just to be very clear, like who is generating the proofs, and then what is the incentive for you to basically run these? Because that's the thing that I still don't fully understand. Actually, even with Celestia as well, Nick, like light nodes, like what is the incentive to actually run these things?
For running a prover, it's really simple. Like people want to pay for proofs because they're paying for like securing their chain, and then you run a prover and you get those fees. So yeah, that's like a very simple explanation. And in terms of like the market size, if you look at like, oh, what's the market for ZK proving? If you let's take like for example the amount paid out to like staking emissions as like a comparison.
Yeah.
I think today there's like $1 billion+ paid out per year in terms of staking emissions, which is the reason people are motivated to run nodes for, a normal network. And let's imagine that ZK is, 10x cheaper than that, and provides like the same amount of value, then that's already like a 9-figure like annual demand side for proof generation. So yeah, I actually think like the fees for proving will be substantial.
Is the vision that it gets paid out in each chain's token? And if I'm running a prover on my laptop at home, then I will be receiving from all of these different chains? Or like, how do you see that playing out?
I don't think it makes sense. Well, right now with staking, yes, it gets paid out in your native token,
Right.
but in the end, like the token is swappable for
of course,
whatever currency the person
fungible.
wants. So like, okay, sure, maybe like Optimism could have, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but like Optimism could have OP inflation to pay for proving, but it doesn't matter. Like that inflation can get swapped before it gets paid to the prover, or it can get swapped after. Like it's kind of the net end outcome.
You can see what I'm getting at here though, right? Is like right now there is this kind of beautiful like lock-in for like each token economy that I think projects and their communities are incentivized to maintain. I mean, even this relates back to the Unichain thing, right? Like we can call a spade. Like part of the motivation for Unichain is probably to give the Uni token the utility of securing the network. It's just, I fully think that ZK is the future, but it's interesting to see what that might do to just incentives around having a token and having a community based around your token, all of that.
I mean, you can still have a token. Like it's actually, I would argue it's better for your token that it's not getting paid out to people who are then going to go like sell it to pay for like their AWS bills to run their node,
Yeah. Jill, we talked about this a little bit, but I really do think like, cause there's this kind of idea of like a token sink, right? Which is, okay, I basically have a bunch of inflation, on any given year, and I want to make sure that that's not, or I've got token unlocks or something like that. So you got to design something in your protocol which incentivizes people to park the token, right? And so you see a bunch of these, like, so the simplest one is just staking, but then there's all these sorts of, I don't know, anything from stuff that actually does make some sense to more like Rube Goldberg-y, like you really have to squint at it to understand why this exists or the friction that this introduces.
Yeah,
but
totally.
I don't know. I kind of just think that the way to solve this is to just create good products that generate a bunch of revenue, and then you don't have to create a token sink and do anything like that.
Nice.
Because people would just want to own the token because the product's really good and there's revenue that's associated with it. I hope that's, I don't know. But,
yeah, exactly. Like look at Base. They make so much money from their sequencer. Honestly, for them, paying for proofs would be a very small fraction of like the real money they earn. And they don't even have a token, right? Like it's just ETH fees for their sequencer.
Totally.
Yeah. Which is pretty substantial as well. Like if you look at any L2's like P&L, you see their revenue gets bucketed basically into, there's a big bucket of that, which is basically just L1 pass through. right? So like if you look at roughly like any like an Arbitrum or something like that, Arbitrum One, about half of their revenue is actually just passed through into the L1 for Ethereum. So yeah, it's pretty substantial. Although obviously that would be much cheaper if you were using like Celestia or AltDA or something like that. I think most of that is just DA fees, so it's probably less depending on the L2. But Uniswap Labs is rolling out the red carpet and launching a $15.5 million bug bounty. This is the largest bug bounty in the entire history of crypto to anyone that can find a critical bug with the Uniswap v4 protocol. This bug bounty aims to make it the most rigorously reviewed code base ever deployed to Ethereum. Now, the Uniswap name is basically synonymous with security. $2.4 trillion in cumulative volume has passed through Uniswap v2 and v3 without a single hack. So Uniswap v4 is dedicated to bringing that same level of security and transparency to the v4 protocol. So if you want more information or eligibility or scope or rewards or payout or any of that good stuff, there's a link in the bottom of the show notes. I highly recommend that you stop listening right now, go to the show notes, click the link, head over and tell them that I sent you. Start earning money today. All right, Uma, so you guys also put out this accompanying document, which is the crisis of trust, which is very cool. I don't know if this looked like maybe a part one, or I don't know if there's other stuff coming after this, but you kind of outlined some future use cases for ZK in general. So some of these were like kind of more media use cases. And this is something that I feel like I've been hearing more and more, that there's just slop, right? Like the ratio of noise to signal is higher than it's ever been, especially on social media. And it's only going to get exacerbated by AI. So I think people are pretty excited about this idea of provenance. And so verifiable media, verifiable hardware, trustless attestations, that type of stuff. Do you want to just walk us through what some of these? I have some thoughts on the media side of things, just because I've thought about media for a long time. But like, I would be curious, when you look out into the world of like super future for ZK, what is the exciting stuff?
ZK outside of blockchains is really exciting to me, as kind of taking the technology beyond just, crypto as we know it. And definitely within that category, verifiable media is very, very cool. So for some background, it's today on Twitter. I'm sure we've all seen those really bad quality bots that are just like replying to everyone. But also with generative AI, we have this phenomenon where it's basically impossible to tell whether an image is real or not. And we're quickly getting to the point where it's really hard to tell if a video is real or not too. And the problem with that, there's a very obvious problems with that, right? Like, how can you verify that any news story is like actually telling you the truth? And the idea behind verifiable media is that basically you can have a camera sign like the image that it's taking with like the hardware. So the hardware basically signs like, hey, I took this image at this time, or I took this video at this time. But then all the images we see on the internet are not raw images, because usually those images are like way, way too big, or like, they need to be like cropped, filtered, edited, whatever. And so the idea is like you apply a set of verifiable transformations to your original raw image. And for each transformation, you generate a proof of it. And then in the end, like, for example, you can imagine a world where all Twitter pictures come with a proof that they were taken from a real camera or physical device and edited with like a set of allowed transformations to make sure that they're actually authentic and not just taken from Midjourney or whatever. So I think that's a super cool use case. Actually, I discovered from my tweet about this that someone is already building or has built a ZK camera that does this, which is really, really cool.
So damn cool. I want one.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I think, Micah, you asked a little bit about like the incentive to run a light node. I think that kind of ties in really well with what Uma was just saying, which like to me, the question of like, why would someone run a light node or, verify things is essentially the same thing as like, why is anyone using HTTPS? It's like, because I want to fucking know that my email or, I'm connected to the right website, all this stuff is real, because so much of my life is on the internet and I don't want that shit to get hacked. So it's the same thing. It's like, if I want to actually have security and know that this image is like actually legitimate, this is real, or when I sent my funds or someone says they paid me this much, I like verified it for myself. I see a little check mark, whatever, in my UI. that is the incentive. And it's not going to cost anyone anything. It's going to be embedded in whatever, wallet or however you're interacting with your chain, your application. It's just going to be there. It's not going to be something that you have to actually, we're stuck in this mentality of like, oh, I've got to run an Ethereum node. Okay, I got to download this software, open a terminal, have my own little thing. It's just going to run on your phone. It's going to run on your browser. And you won't think about it. And you're going to feel safe. You're going to get the benefits of knowing that like what's real and what's fake, what's true and what's not. You're going to have security over all your assets that live on chain. So to me, it's like kind of a no-brainer.
I have an alternative theory for you.
Okay.
And I see people getting flamed for this take. And I know C-Node hates this when people say this type of stuff, but I actually don't think, depressingly, that people would do that on their own. Even though there are all these benefits, I just don't see people doing it. I think people are lazy and generally like won't do things even if it's for their own benefit, if it's an extra step. I do think that governments might end up mandating this. I don't know. There's something I thought was kind of interesting. Was I don't know if you guys saw Brian Armstrong and Elon Musk talking about potentially putting like the U.S. Treasury like balance sheet and payment system on chain. Now that's not going to happen. That's like weird posturing, but it's interesting. It's kind of interesting, right? That they're thinking like that. And it obviously is like, I've been feeling really optimistic lately. I know everyone's so bummed out. I think to me, when I got into crypto in 2017, there were all these things that felt really far off. It was like enterprise block, like companies are going to build on blockchain and like ICOs are going to disrupt VCs and all this other stuff that if you sounded kind of like a lunatic, especially when prices were going down. But that stuff doesn't feel that far off to me anymore. And there were huge bet. And I think we have to go back and revisit some of those conversations and like think this is one of those classic, you overestimate what you can do in 1 year, but you underestimate what you can do in 10. And that stuff doesn't feel that far off to me. And I think there are huge benefits to moving things on chain. And one of the things I've been thinking about ZK actually is, there are two benefits to ZK. There's the succinctness of the proof and there's the privacy. And I've heard a lot of people say, what's really interesting is the succinctness of the proof and the privacy is not that interesting. I've been wondering for a while if actually the privacy is about to be more interesting. Like, just imagine a hypothetical world where you moved a bunch of company infrastructure on chain. The number one thing that you'd be concerned about that with is privacy. And
Totally.
I've been wondering if the privacy thing, and the reason why that would be so cool as well is if I had one ideological drive, it would actually be privacy. And this would be not like an ideological, hey, I think people should be entitled to their privacy. It would be a real business case for privacy, which is what got us through with like PGP back in the day too. It was not an ideological thing. It was businesses demanding it. So
I think that's spot on. It's all of these things that we who got into this space in 2017 or 2014 or whatever, we thought that these were like cypherpunk, I don't know, like libertarian ideals. They're actually enterprise features. Like, okay, they can be both at the same time, but privacy, I think, will get adopted because it's an enterprise feature. Because Circle, as an example, wants to go to market with enterprises and get enterprises using stablecoins for big cross-chain payments. They need privacy for that, and they need to be able to reconcile that with also like on-chain verifiability. That's where ZK comes in. But I think that that's totally in line with what Nick was saying, because like I, as a user, when I use the internet, I'm not making a choice to use HTTPS. Like, I'm not like ticking a box or like
right.
My browser is taking care of all of that for me, right? And like the web developers who build the company's websites that I'm going to, they're all taking care of all of that for me. I think, again, I'm a huge Apple stan, whatever. Like, I think Apple is a great example of this, right? Where a huge part of their brand is privacy and security at actually a huge cost to them at times in terms of UX. But like, I think that they have done the calculus that is a strong enough brand position where they want to make their user base feel safe and secure, that it's worth that trade-off to them. And I think that that's the case for a lot of companies, but all of these things are enterprise. It's not. And I think that the way that manifests too is social pressure. I mean, maybe this is a good segue into like Arbitrum and Bold, but like, why does anyone care or even know like what the security assumptions of a rollup are, it's because L2 beat exists and they have this really easy to grok like pizza pie of green, yellow, or red slices that gives you an intuition for what security assumptions you're making. That's very much akin to HTTP versus PS, and like people do care. So then the enterprises, the roll up teams in this case, make progress on these things. I think you guys actually agree though, Mike and Nick. I think it's just where it sits. Is it an individual or is it a company?
I definitely agree. I mean, I just think that to Mike's point, like, yes, if there was overhead, much fewer people will do it, but my point is there will be no overhead. It will just be baked in and by default. Verifiability by default is like kind of what I believe in. And I also think this kind of goes back to cryptographic security versus economic security. Blockchains will not scale with economic security because the way that economic security works is like we have to have literally as much value staked as there is secured by this chain. So if we have literally the world's economy on chain, like tens or hundreds of trillions of dollars every year, whatever, we literally need to have that much money staked. If we're just relying on the goodwill of all the validators, right? But the beauty of cryptographic security from data availability sampling and from things like SP1 and ZK proofs is like they can't cheat you. So you don't have, we can have like maybe just $10 billion worth of stake. The only thing they can do is try to double spend or, fork the chain and stuff like that, or try to censor you. But there's other things we can do to like prevent those things from happening. So that's why I've always been bearish on restaking, because like economic security has always been a little patch over that we're relying on, unfortunately, in the near term, till we get to Valhalla of just pure cryptographic security, or as much towards cryptographic security as possible.
Yeah, the other people used to debate that in Cosmos a long time ago as well. Like this is just as usual; they're always. But the other thing too that's challenging with it's just not very capital efficient. It's not. It doesn't really economically make sense from the perspective of the L1. It's not very capital efficient. And the other challenge with it is there's this weird principal agent problem as well. That's like pretty undesirable from like most of the time. Like in theory, you're supposed to be putting up your own capital that could get slashed for performing in the way that the network wants it to perform. But usually you delegate, right? So the staking operators aren't even really putting up their own capital. It's like whoever delegates to you. So now I think the professional operators like in slashing events actually compensate their customers. So and they have like legal, there are all of these other considerations. I think in practice it works, but yeah, it's not super ideal.
So I just want to close the loop on one last point related to this on why not build your own L1 and why share a DA layer and consensus layer for interoperability is because if you want cryptographic security level interoperability with other apps or chains, you need to share a DA and consensus layer. There's no way around that. And so like, again, most bridges now, if you have a separate L1 and you're trying to bridge to each other, then you're going to default to economic security. That's pretty much, it's going to be a committee-based thing. And again, that's not going to scale. That's not going to be how this like Web3, like verifiable internet is going to work. When we get to that end game, it's going to have to be, or we're going to want to have it be cryptographic security for interoperability as well. Anyway, that's like.
I fully agree with that. Yeah. I think that is what I was saying earlier. I think that is the challenge for Ethereum, right? It's like, can they be that layer? Are they designed to be that layer? I think today, probably not, which is why they need these other layers to come in, whether it's like Celestia for DA or Espresso for confirmations, etc. I think that, yeah, hopefully we can put pressure on Ethereum to figure it out. But
I mean, does it seem like, because the roadmap from my vantage point is, it looks a lot, to be honest, like Celestia's roadmap, right? Like it's big blocks, single slot finality, more blobs, but it doesn't seem like whenever you push that, people get very upset. Like I saw David Hoffman tweeted out like the boat thing about there's a hole in the boat and it's like, oh, well, do you have any ideas? Or like, I actually like holes in boats. Look at like, don't insult our boat. And I don't know. I just get a lot of that. Like there's not much incentive, right? Sometimes it feels a little tough to.
There's not much incentive until the market forces you to take a hard look at it. And I think that's starting to happen. So
yeah, it's a good point. All right, let's talk about maybe close on bold here. And I actually went back and looked up some of the history of just fault proofs in general. And like, it's been a long, these were originally theorized like way before even rollups in general. And I think Arbitrum's first white paper came out a year before the idea of like optimistic rollups was formalized in 20. So I think the Arbitrum white paper is 2018. This white paper came out in 2019. And then Vitalik didn't write about rollups until I think like 2021. So this was like a long time coming. And yeah, the origins of this was to get around this security model, Nick, that you were talking about, which is the honest majority assumption, which is basically what we've wound up with. And it's the ability to generate basically a proof which verifies that someone behaved incorrectly, and then you could verify it very easily. And so that has been what we've been trying to drive towards with rollups for a very long time. The idea is you have off-chain computation in the form of rollups, but and we just assume that all that computation is being done with integrity, but there should be a way to just prove if there was if someone did something wrong, and then it should be very easy to verify that. So we've been waiting for a long time. It's been like 3 or 4 years, and these are critical towards getting to stage 2, which is a security level of rollups, which I think Arbitrum is now the closest to getting to. And I think there's 2 reasons for this, which is one, there are a lot of considerations in terms of designing what these fault-proof systems look like. And I think the number one challenge, and you guys probably know more about this than me, so correct me if I'm wrong, is just the ability to Sybil attack, right? So you could very easily just submit a proof, right, that something is wrong. There's like a window where all transactions for the chain get shut down and reviewed, and you could just keep rolling that. So it's a form of attack on the chain. And so you have now with Arbitrum, we can get into some of the details, but they basically have multiple rounds, and they introduced a bond, which is relatively high. I saw 1,100 ETH, which is very substantial in dollar terms. I think what it actually boiled down to is something like 600 or 700. You have to put up 555 in the first round, and then another 79, I think, after that. But either way, we're still substantially quite a bit of money. But this is also significant because I think a year and a half ago, Vitalik said something to the effect of, "Hey, I'm going to exert social pressure to move rollups towards L2s." And I think that gets at the other motivation here, or why this might have taken so long, is because it doesn't really seem like there's a direct profit incentive for them to do it, because we all kind of found out that everyone's mostly okay with just trusting the L2 frameworks. So I'd be curious what you all think about, this particular implementation of fraud proofs, and we can get into some of the mechanics. But I guess the questions that I have for you guys as well is like, do you think this moves the needle in terms of users, adoption, et cetera? Like, what do you all think?
On that front, I think, unfortunately, probably not really. Like, again, I think that so much of this just comes down to social pressure, right? I think that most users and most app developers were actually pretty comfortable with the more permission status quo. Like, I don't think that there has ever historically been an issue with this, at least on Arbitrum. But I think that the social pressure, and this relates to the last conversation that we were having, is really important. And I think Vitalik coming out and saying that, like, we've got to start being honest about what these L2s are. And if you're not making progress to stage 2, then that's a problem. I think L2 Beat, again, is out there doing God's work on this front and trying to educate people as to what these risks are. Because none of these risks matter to anyone until they really matter. I think it's also a bit of it, to me, even it's just like it cements Arbitrum in my mind as being the most mature in terms of technology. Like, that's a huge part of their brand. That's a huge part of their identity. That's a huge part in general of what I think attracts so many developers and so much capital into their ecosystem. Like, Uma, you made this point a couple of weeks ago that, if you look at where capital moves, it does actually, like, when you're talking about big size, it does actually tend to follow where there are fewer security assumptions. Like, I think you were talking about this in the context of Bitcoin rollups and that potentially being a bull case for Bitcoin rollups. And I mean, Arbitrum, I think, has always been number one in terms of TVL. Base is hot on its heels, but Arbitrum for a long time has been head and shoulders above the pack. So I do think it does matter in this kind of like zoomed out, grander vision type way. But do I think that it meaningfully brings over devs like tomorrow to Arbitrum, I think probably not.
Yeah, I think that's my curiosity long term as well. There's a John Charbonneau wrote a post about this. He was described like basically on Bitcoin L2s making the argument that security actually might matter quite a bit more for Bitcoin L2s than Ethereum L2s. But yeah, what was very surprising to me in that post is just how little ETH had migrated up to L2s for the most part already. It's like 2.5%. And actually, if you look at L2 beat, and I'd be curious, Nick, how you see this playing out in Celestia as well. But if you look at the amount, like the lifetime amount here of, let's see, I can go back to max. Just the total amount here of, I guess this is just assets on, it says total value secured. So I'm assuming that's just the amount of assets on all the L2s. They break it out by canonically bridged from Ethereum, externally bridged, and native. And if you go back in time, you can see the native bucket was very, very small back in like 2022 or 2023, sub 1 billion. And now that's grown to being actually more than at parity with the amount that's been bridged. So that's basically what that's saying is the amount of like L2s were supposed to be acquiring new users that Ethereum or Celestia or whatever chain otherwise wouldn't necessarily have. And so you can see that the majority of assets on these L2s are not being bridged up from main chain anymore. They're being minted or bridged from other chains or something like that. Which I think is ultimately the goal, and that's good. And so maybe that is a little bit of incentive, right? For you do want like the safest sort of chain. But I agree with you, Joe. I think it's going to take a little while for that to actually kick in. But
if you scroll down, maybe we can see the actual Ethereum breakout. Oh, never mind. Okay, I thought it'd be by asset. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I've always believed that, frankly, like the native asset issuance on rollups and L2s will eclipse. Like, it doesn't make sense for L1 to be the home of all these assets and then they get bridged up. To me, it's like these are their own chains. They're going to have their own native assets, and that's the way that it should be. And it's already playing out, and that's also why, for example, why there's more of a push for sovereign rollups now, because like paying this high cost of having to like settle down to Ethereum, which is higher than it should be, partly because Ethereum is not really has certain like trade-offs in terms of like how forkful it is and things like that. It's like overly complex. It's less worth it these days. Like, if you're not really trying to onboard ETH assets, you don't really care about that. There's no real reason to be an ETH L2 or rollup unless you want ETH security for some reason. But like I don't know. I just feel like that was kind of obvious to me, and it seems to be playing out.
What is the catalyst for making L2s very secure and actually translating that into some sort of market outcome, right? Like, are we waiting for full stage 2 here? Are we waiting for some sort of external catalyst, like more institutional money coming into the space and understanding the security trade-offs? Like, it makes sense to me in theory, right, that having a much more secure, if an L2 is perceived to be as secure as the L1, then more institutional money should be the unlock there. So I'm just curious if that's just like it's a matter of time thing, or I'm just curious like what the catalyst like you all see being.
This is maybe a very Debbie Downer negative take, but I think that the catalyst is always something bad actually happening. I think that's, if you look historically, like when did people start really caring about bridge trust assumptions? It was after, I don't know, the Ronin bridge and Wormhole, all of these big hacks actually happened. I think this is something I feel particularly with like sequencer equivocation. Everyone is cool just trusting the Arbitrum sequencer and the base sequencer. At some point, the sequencer is going to equivocate, whether it's because it's been hacked or something else, or bad actors on the other side, and then suddenly everyone's really going to care about that, and all of the solver-based bridges are going to be broken. But yeah, it's kind of I don't know. Someone else who's an optimist on this call will have a better take, but that's my perspective.
Not to keep bringing up this, but do you see, like, there's a bunch of regulation that's happening in the US over the course of the next certainly year. Like, it's the focus right now is stable coins, then the FIT market structure bill. But do you ever see, big important jurisdiction like this getting opinionated on the security assumptions of how these chains get built? Or do you think that, you know what I mean? Like, if this was right, if what we're building here has a big capital markets or financial markets sort of look and feel to it, like there's a bunch of value that's moving around, people trade on it. Do you not think that eventually, like, regulators and governments will have opinions on this type of stuff? Do you think that's really far out? I mean, what do
Maybe
you
in
think?
terms of disclosures, I don't see
Yeah.
them regulating, at least in the US, regulating the tech directly, but certainly in terms of disclosures and consumer protection. But I can't keep up with what's going on in Washington. I think I read yesterday that Elon Musk had disbanded the consumer protection, the Consumer Financial Protection Board. So, like, I don't see that happening anytime soon. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Again, I can't keep up.
We need some verified media, Uma, because it's like a blitz of information, and I honestly can't tell what's real and what's not
Okay, right?
real.
Yeah. I feel like I sit down to dinner every night and my husband's like, "Oh, did you see what Elon did?" And I'm like, I thought that was a meme. I don't know. I'm kind of into it, but I don't know.
No, yeah, there was this picture of Elon wearing like the huge hat, like the really, really big hat next to Trump. And I
Oh,
had
yeah,
no
yeah, yeah.
idea if it was photoshopped or real or whatever. And that was kind of like an inconsequential picture, so it's like, okay, whatever. But I do think there is a future where like everything will need a proof attached to it that it's real or not. Because otherwise we're descending into madness. Like quite rapidly.
Reality is stranger than fiction these days. Yeah, we need some ZK proofs.
Yeah. I've had Elon muted for a while. I like a lot of his stuff, but I just can't take his Twitter stuff. It's crazy. But yeah. All right, guys. Well, maybe we can wrap it here. I know we're waiting towards the top of the hour, but cool. This was a fun one, guys. I appreciate you all, and yeah, we'll see you next week.